In 2006, Starbucks was opening stores at the rate of approximately 6 per day. In the United States, in certain urban markets, Starbucks locations were sometimes visible from each other across an intersection. The company's growth rate was extraordinary. Its stock performance was exceptional, and Howard Schultz, who had stepped back from the CEO role in 2000, was watching from the position of chairman. In February 2007, Schultz sent an internal memo to the company's leadership. The memo was not meant to be public. It became public, and it became one of the most cited documents in modern retail strategy, not for its elegance, but for its precision about a specific problem that was already visible from inside the company, even as the external metrics continued to look strong. The memo described what Schultz called the watering down of the Starbucks experience, the specific ways that rapid expansion had required operational compromises, each individually reasonable, whose cumulative effect was that the core of what had made Starbucks compelling to its customers was becoming less present in the company's stores. The smell of coffee was replaced by the smell of pre-packaged sandwiches being heated. The sound of espresso being pulled was replaced by the mechanical sound of automated equipment. The barista's relationship with the customer was compressed by the throughput requirements of higher volume locations. None of these were catastrophic. Each was a rational operational response to the demands of operating at scale. Together, they described a company that had been running a strategy for long enough to approach, and then exceed, the ceiling of what that strategy could produce. That ceiling, the point above which a successful strategy stops generating returns and begins degrading what made the returns possible, is one of the least examined phenomena in organizational strategy. Not because it doesn't exist, but because from below it the ceiling is invisible. The strategy ceiling is not the same as market saturation, though it is often confused with it. Market saturation is a condition of the market. There are no more customers to acquire. The strategy ceiling is a condition of the strategy. The approach that generated growth begins at sufficient scale to undermine the conditions that made growth possible. Starbucks in 2006 and 2007 was not running out of coffee drinkers. American coffee consumption was rising. The market for premium coffee was expanding. The ceiling Starbucks was approaching was internal. The specific experience that had made Starbucks's premium positioning defensible, the quality cues, the sensory environment, the sense of having chosen something over the ordinary, was being diluted by the operational requirements of the growth rate the strategy was producing. At a smaller number of stores, quality control is achievable through direct attention. At 6 stores per day, quality control is achievable only through standardization. Standardization, applied to the things that made Starbucks feel premium, produces something that is more consistent than what Schultz had built and less premium than what customers were paying for. That's the ceiling. The strategy's own success generates requirements that begin to contradict the strategy's core proposition. This pattern appears across industries and across decades. Subway expanded to become the restaurant chain with the most locations in the world, surpassing McDonald's in store count. The expansion required a franchise model that decentralized quality control in ways that, by the 2010s, had produced significant inconsistency in the customer experience across locations, an inconsistency that research suggested was correlated with declining same-store sales. The growth that the strategy produced created the conditions that undermined what the strategy was built on. Have you ever watched an organization approach its own strategy ceiling, where the scale the strategy produced began to erode the thing the strategy depended on? Leave a comment. Schultz returned as CEO in January 2008. The steps he took are instructive, specifically because they were structural rather than tactical. He closed all U.S. Starbucks stores for 3.5 hours on February 26, 2008, 7,100 locations simultaneously for barista retraining. The decision cost the company approximately $6 million in lost revenue for a single afternoon. The purpose was not primarily to improve barista skills. The purpose was to demonstrate internally and externally that the company was willing to subordinate short-term revenue to the proposition that the quality of the experience was non-negotiable. He eliminated the pre-packaged sandwiches that had been introduced to drive food revenue, and that Schultz had identified in his 2007 memo as one of the specific experience diluters. The sandwiches were revenue-generating. They were also changing the sensory environment of the stores in ways that contradicted the coffee experience the company was charging a premium for. He chose the experience over the revenue line. He closed approximately 900 stores, primarily the ones that had been opened at the highest pace during the overexpansion period and that were, in many cases, cannibalizing sales from nearby locations rather than generating genuinely new revenue. The closures were not an admission that the strategy had been wrong. They were an acknowledgement that the strategy had been executed beyond its own ceiling. The specific mechanism here, closing stores that were generating positive revenue because those stores were damaging the proposition that all other stores depended on, is the counterintuitive response to a strategy ceiling, and it is the response that most organizations facing this situation choose not to make, because it requires accepting a near-term loss to protect the conditions for long-term return. If this level of strategic mechanism, not expand or contract, but what does each unit of growth do to the thing growth depends on, is the analysis you come here for. The like is the direct signal. The employees who worked at the 900 stores Schultz closed were not employed by a company that was failing. Many of those stores were profitable. The decision to close them was not driven by their individual performance. It was driven by what their collective presence was doing to the network they were part of, specifically to the experience that the premium pricing of every store in the network depended on. This is an experience that is genuinely difficult to communicate to an employee whose individual store is performing well. Your store is being closed not because it isn't working, but because the number of stores like yours has exceeded the ceiling of what the strategy that supports your pricing can sustain. Schultz's reorientation of Starbucks between 2008 and 2011 is one of the cleaner case studies in strategy ceiling management, which is why it's also one of the more referenced. But it is not a typical outcome. Most organizations that approach their strategy ceiling do not pull back voluntarily. They continue the strategy until the ceiling produces results that are clearly negative, and then they diagnose the negative results as execution failures rather than as strategy ceiling encounters, and they respond with operational fixes that don't address the structural issue. The strategy ceiling is hard to see from below it because the metrics that are most available, revenue, store count, market share, continue to look good even after the ceiling has been approached. The metric that is most relevant, the marginal impact of each additional unit of scale on the core proposition the strategy is built around, is rarely tracked, rarely quantified, and rarely part of the strategic conversation until the ceiling has already been exceeded. The practical response to the strategy ceiling is a specific kind of strategic audit that most organizations never conduct. For each unit of growth the current strategy is generating, what is the effect on the conditions the strategy requires to continue generating growth? This is different from a standard market analysis, which asks whether there are more customers to acquire. It is also different from an operational analysis, which asks whether the current units are performing to standard. It asks a more uncomfortable question. As the strategy succeeds, does it produce conditions that undermine its own future success? For Starbucks, the answer was yes. At sufficient scale, the expansion strategy was producing operational compromises that degraded the premium experience, which degraded the pricing power, which degraded the margin, which degraded the returns from future expansion. For Subway, the answer was similar. At sufficient scale, the franchise model produced quality inconsistency that degraded the brand, which degraded traffic, which degraded the franchise economics, which reduced the quality of future franchisees. For a smaller organization, a consultancy, a software company, a restaurant group, the ceiling may arrive at 10 clients, or 20 employees, or 4 locations. The scale is different. The mechanism is the same. The strategy succeeds, and in succeeding, it creates conditions that the strategy wasn't built to handle, and those conditions begin to degrade the thing that made the strategy successful. The question is not whether you will encounter the ceiling, you will. The question is whether you will see it coming, while the metrics that are easiest to measure still look strong, or whether you will discover it only after the thing it was protecting has already been degraded. The next episode looks at a case where the ceiling was encountered, recognized, and responded to, and where the response created a different kind of problem that the organization was even less prepared to handle. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.